So our topic today for the April CityThink is form-based codes. And before I introduce our moderators, I just want to point out that today's format is, even though we have a small audience, is similar to the TV show format that TK and Christine moderated for the Design Center called City Visions, which was funded by a grant from the Tennessee Arts Commission and actually continues to appear on Metro Channel 10 education channel. I keep catching it as I'm running through there. So you can also view these on our website. And so we're going to consider today as like a live version of the City Vision show, and I'll tape this and I'll have it available online. I think it's a great topic for people to be interested in watching. And Christine even told me that she had always wanted to do multiple guests on the show, but the set really didn't work out for that, so I just need the big sign in the background that says City Visions. So joining us today are hosts are no strangers to Nashville. Christine Kreyling is an architectural design critic, freelance journalist, and author of several books, including The Plan of Nashville Avenues to a Great City, and TK Davis, who is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, an associate professor at the University of Tennessee College of Architecture and Design, focusing on urban design studios and theory. And TK is also, you all know, the former design director of the Nashville Civic Design Center, where he served 4 years. And our guests today are Rick Bernhardt, who is executive director of the Metro Nashville-Davidson County Planning Commission. Rick is a town planner for 35 years and was the former director of EDO's Town Planning Studio and Planning and Development Director for the City of Orlando. He has served as the chair of the Planners Task Force for the Congress for New Urbanism and is currently on the board of the Form-Based Codes Institute. Next we have David McGowan, who is the president of Regent's Home and the developer of Lenox Village, which was Nashville's first traditional neighborhood development of its kind, and also Regent Homes' first T&D community, and is also considered an example of a form-based code in Nashville. And finally, David Koellein, who has from Nashville native, and has a degree in urban studies and political science from Lipscomb, as well as a master's in urban planning from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. And David worked for 4 years at MBHA in the urban development group, and for the past 2 years at Giarratana Development, where he has worked on form-based codes as well, I believe, for the Nashville program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to TK. Let me get the microphones first, please.
Thank you, Gary. It's great to be back. Actually, that event next week starts at 10. It probably goes to about 5:30. And please stop by. I think it's going to be extremely interesting. We may be working on TOD at other stations next fall, or next crop of graduate students. I thought that what I might do is just kick things off for 5 minutes to get everybody on kind of the same page, and then throw a question to Rick, and we take it from there in a fairly freewheeling way. All right. Some of you may not be, but I think everyone here is aware that the downtown code is well underway in terms of a very complex process involving public participation. Some of you know that it's a form-based code proposal, and so we might take just a minute to define what that is in the words of Metro Planning, actually. So we're all starting with the same baseline. And then I'll describe a handful of things that are typically found in these codes as either an expectation or as an option. And then a question. What is a form-based code? A form-based code, as it's been defined here in Nashville, and this pretty much conforms to what the Form-Based Code Institute would write, or other cities perhaps, I suppose, is a method of regulating development to achieve a specific and predictable urban form. A form-based code uses a series of interrelated objectives to create a complete urban environment, including buildings, streets, and open space. Form-based code is place-based, meaning that it's created through an understanding of community context and is customized for a specific location. So what you would expect to find in the form-based code is, first of all, a regulating plan, and that's the definition of the area. In this case, it's the downtown loop, as downtown is classically defined, anything within that being north south of Jefferson being downtown. And in this case, Metro Planning has broken it down to roughly 15 sub-districts, each having their own kind of scale and character and constituency. You expect to find public space standards because it's all about defining a beautiful, vibrant public sphere. And so you frequently would find a typology of different kinds of streets, like primary streets, you might think of Broadway, or secondary streets, such as 3rd Avenue, or neighborhood streets like 9th Avenue North, or what might be classified as other streets, other thoroughfares, like the big trench of the interstate end on the west side. You know, those don't fit into any of the category and aren't intrinsically having the same potential in terms of pedestrian activity. Also alleyways, which are a huge opportunity in most cities, or many cities at least, and certainly in Nashville. You'll also find a typology of civic spaces. Those have been defined here as greens, squares, plazas, courts, and one of my favorites, pocket parks or playgrounds. There are building form standards. These are regulations that control the configuration and features and the way buildings function as well, that define and shape the public realm. It's very important to have clearly defined project review and approval process and a method for dealing with non-conformities, and that's typically laid out in what might be called the administration component of the general conditions. And then there's a definition, because it's very important that everyone's defining things in the same terms, both lay people and professionals. And so there's almost always a glossary used to ensure a precise understanding of technical terms. Now sometimes you get into architectural standards, such as massing, facade composition, windows and doors, elements and details, and materials. Landscaping standards, such as landscape design and plant materials on private property as they impact public spaces. Signage standards are very important as an optional component, where the signs that are going to be permissible are prescribed in terms of their maximum size, the materials, illumination, and their placement. Environmental resource standards in this day and age are terribly important. So issues like stormwater drainage and infiltration, development on slopes, tree protection, and solar access rise to the foreground as considerations within that category of content. And finally, there's the whole annotative part of the code, and that is both the text and illustrations that explain, hopefully very, very clearly, the intentions of specific code provisions. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be neutral here. I'm a big proponent of form-based codes. I think it's the future. It's working in other cities. We have plenty of documentation of it now. It's a big advance over, in my judgment, over traditional zoning. But having said that, maybe I could ask Rick, how do you see form-based code as being an improvement over traditional or conventional zoning?
I think clearly form-based codes are a much better way to regulate development, primarily because they are intended to achieve a pre-decided intention. I mean, they're proactive. They're a way to allow a community to define what its vision is and then move towards that, as opposed to the conventional zoning approach, which is basically reactive, if you will, or it's fundamentally intended to achieve two basic objectives, which is to generally segregate land uses and to regulate density and intensity, not necessarily to create a strong public realm or sense of place and that. I think that form-based codes are an option. They've been very successful in Nashville. I don't know, we've probably, through our design process, developed maybe 15 or 20 communities that are actually currently in the process of being implemented through form-based codes. And I think that...
like, give me an example. Do an example.
You mentioned the most recent one that's underway right now is the downtown code, but if you can kind of go back and look at some of the very early movings early in Nashville towards form-based codes, the UCO overlay was an initial kind of taste of that, but everything from Hillsborough Village, Green Hills, Bedford Avenue, West End Park, Rural Hill, Lennox Village, Carruthers Crossing. We've got them in the suburban areas, Hamilton Hills, Hickory Woods. There's a number of them that are out there that basically, I think, do a lot of things. One, it's a way to look at place building, obviously. But generally, what it does is allow you to work with a community to get a diversity of housing, more walkable communities, higher intensity development than you ever would be able to do that in a conventional zoning approach, because you have a sense and know what's coming forward. At least in Nashville, and obviously some of the issues always arise around architectural controls. I don't think, there may be one or two of the form-based codes that were, in this case, might have been developer proposed that have some architectural standards. But in our case, we have very few architectural standards. They're primarily on creating public space, massing, relationship to buildings, as opposed to the architecture of the buildings themselves.
You know, Rick, in addition to what you just mentioned, that might be included in conventional zoning, you often have parking requirements that are extravagant. It talks about typically setback minimums, when what would be far more valuable, I think, found in a form-based code is a build-to line. So in essence, philosophically, you're talking about what you want people to do prescriptively as opposed to proscriptively what you don't want them to do. There's also oftentimes limits on heights of buildings, but there's no discussion in traditional zoning about a building that's simply too low for its context, you know? Certain streets need a certain height of building to sort of define them.
I think the focus, again, of form-based codes is in how the buildings address the public realm to create a sense of space, and that distance between building front to building front, and how can it be done in a way that is really focused on the individual as opposed to simply the automobile. How can you combine those, but in a way that creates a quality public space?
And let me ask you also as a follow-up, there's a third category of quasi-regulation, which would be called design guidelines. And I'm wondering, you might explicate what you might find in typical design guidelines and why they are not adequate compared to form-based codes and what you job done.
Well, design guidelines typically are focused, are generally focused on individual buildings. I mean, how do the buildings themselves, how are they designed? They're not necessarily focused on creating a block face or an ensemble of buildings that tend to work together to kind of pull you along there. And I think that design guidelines, and generally the way they've been applied, are architectural standards, and they may or may not be appropriate in terms of looking at the overall, if you will, the urban design component, which I think is a very different element than an architectural component, an architectural design of a building. It's they're looking at two different, totally different things. One is creating a whole space, and the other is kind of regulating how a building itself looks.
We usually find design guidelines inside the form-based.
You may very well, but you may find design guidelines or architectural standards within that. But we have an awful lot that don't have architectural standards, and there you have a whole array of architectural styles, but they tend to work together because what you've done is look at how does the block face work, how does the massing work, the spacing between the buildings work, and regardless of what the architectural style is, the buildings will tend to go together and complement each other.
There's it says in the introduction to the downtown code that it makes the process of developing in downtown easier. Is that for the developer?
I think so, because the regulations are relatively straightforward and simple, and you can take those regulations and you know what you're designing towards. You know what your minimum height is, what your maximum height is, what your percentage of transparency is, the location of the building, whether or not you can access that for parking, the location of the parking, and then within that basic set of framework, you go design your building. And it's a lot more predictable, and I think for the designer and the property owner and developer, there's a lot more certainty that if you hit those points, you can go forward. It's relatively straightforward.
Well, let's let the two Davids who are developers talk about that. You do Lennox Village, and then you can be your skeptical self.
Well, I think one of the things that, you know, from a developer standpoint, it allows you to build a community, not a project. And so when you start doing a job like we did, which was a greenfield situation, you got to look at a community like that. It's going to take time to develop it right. And it lays out a long-range plan with a lot of options that you can do. So a form-based code can give you a lot of flexibility to be able to build different products. So instead of just building a single-family home, you might be able to do a townhouse next to it or a town center home. You might be able to add some mixed-use buildings and stuff of that nature. So it allows you to adjust to the marketplace over time and build a true community, what I call an authentic community. I think that, the codes and the things that we have here, there's a couple of slide pieces we got out of some presentations we make, and we say that codes, lot size, and flexibility matters. And so a form-based code gives a developer not only what you can do with parking and access, but it also gives you density. So you can go do a financial plan, and you can run your numbers and say, does it work? You can put it on a piece of paper, take it to your bank. And so at the same time, I think the form-based code usually would spell out what we see. It would tell you some design standards, what they expect you to maybe be building the buildings out of. And then, like you say, the minimum build-to line. The parking requirements. We're doing a job right now down in Murfreesboro, and we're actually meeting with the city planner again. And when they stamped our plans for construction, they put a little red stamp on there. And now all of a sudden, the parking is an issue because of the job is going to be very easy to build out and develop. And we use a lot of the guidelines we use up here, but at the same time, they want one car spot for every bedroom, and they want one parking lot for every 2 seats in a restaurant. You start looking at, hey, wait a minute, your parking is going to kill the job. So what we look at as a form-based code, it really gives you something that we're going to do downtown. It really puts in place a long-term plan for the city that multiple developers can go into. We went into West End Park. We built 3 buildings down there. There was an additional 19 buildings built in West End Park, and it's totally revitalized that area down in West End Park. And if you haven't been down to see some of those buildings, very diverse architecture. And at the same time, we took the route. We wanted some very traditional looking, but there are some urban buildings in there too. So I think it does lay a path out for a developer to go down there and be able to redevelop the city. The only thing I think the form-based code needs to address going forward is something we just experienced, and that is financing. The cities across the United States that we're monitoring right now are addressing the issue of what's happened to some of the developments out there have been that the federal government decided to eliminate seller-assisted down payment. 5th and Main, everybody wants to look at it and say it was a location, and this, that, and the other with 5th and Main. The bottom line is the federal government changed the guidelines for financing that type of product. There is no financing to be able to be had for that product right now. And so one of the things I do think cities adapting form-based codes for residential purposes are going to have to look at what means to the individual that you're trying to get in that product, which is mainly workforce housing. What means do they have to be able to buy that product? What is the financial vehicle? There was an article being built the other day. What state just took the money? Utah. Utah just took all their money. There's a lot of money they got from the TAR and the stimulus package and put it in seller-assisted down payment in order to address the housing needs in that particular state. So I do think that's something that the city's going to have to come back and look at and say, okay, it's good to plan some of this stuff, but is the financing there now? And what means that we need to do it? Tennessee, we're lucky in Tennessee. Tennessee does have a good program right now for a down payment assistance program. But most of your people coming into the workforce that will work in these cities, they usually are strapped with loans from the student loans from getting educated, as with car loan and stuff like that. And mom and dad doesn't have a lot of unlimited resources. And so I do think it's something that the city's going to have to look at. But it's really a side issue to form-based code, but at the same time, it's a piece of the puzzle.
What about the challenges, though? Downtown seems like it, I mean, I get when you're new town planning, essentially, but in terms of the downtown, what are the challenges or perhaps limits that a form-based code does?
Christine said, I'm going to give the skeptic's viewpoint. I don't know if I will, but I will say I'm very conflicted about the idea of form-based codes about this as a think it's certainly an appropriate substitute for what we have been doing, the land use regulation that has led to the built environment that we have now. That was probably a dumb experiment that we've been through for several decades now. The idea that space is much more important than the individual building, or that the composition of buildings is much more important than the individual building or the individual lot, I think is certainly appropriate in terms of what a form-based code or any other regulatory tool should address. I think the downtown form-based code that's been created, credit where it's due, and kudos to the planning staff. I think it's been an extremely thoughtful process. It's involved a lot of significant players. And probably if any good downtown form-based code has a chance to survive and create a thriving downtown, I think we've got the one that will do it. I guess my question about applying a form-based code to a downtown is more sort of fundamental, the idea of predictability being a virtue in a downtown setting, where you have such an intense variety of building types, an intense variety of scale and style, materials, and so forth, whether or not it's going to achieve that balance that's described, whether or not you're going to be able to sort of rein all these differences in and create something cohesive, and whether or not that would be a virtue if you could. So I think we've got to sort of road test this downtown form-based code, but we'll see.
Well, I'm just wondering about the impact on architecture. I haven't read the whole downtown code, but I skimmed through all of it, and I'm just wondering, could you do a secret building or something like that with this form-based code? Or would that just, that kind of a, and I'm not saying you want 100 of those, but I think New York is better off for having that one.
Well, I think you've raised a couple of points. Road testing the code is critically important, and we're trying to do that. And part of the work that's been done so far has been to have people engaged that actually design buildings and can predict that. Our intent is not to stifle the architecture, and I think that if you kind of look back on some of the codes that existed in New York and some of those cities, really were form-based codes of their time. And so, to that degree, we're not there. What we have found, however, is that almost every major building in downtown that's been built over the last 10 years has not been able to have been built under the codes that we have today. They have required a variance, they have required rezoning, we simply couldn't do it. And in order to build buildings under the code, if you simply follow the code and the sky exposure plan and some of those requirements, they wouldn't turn out to be buildings that you either want to build or are economically feasible. So what we've tried to do in terms of developing the form-based code is to utilize standard architectural increments, floor plates for both parking and building, and to look at, well, how do the buildings meet the street in terms of just a relatively consistent storefront. Where do you want to have access into your parking garages? Do you want those on your primary pedestrian streets or on your secondary streets? And we've tried to work through those. And I think there's a lot of flexibility, at least we believe there's an awful lot of flexibility architecturally to develop those. Now, I will say there probably are some iconic buildings that I can think of that probably wouldn't meet the code, and you might want to, you want to talk about those, but we're really not zoning for the iconic building, we're zoning for the vast majority of buildings that actually are going to be covered.
I would argue the iconic building should be the civic building, it's not corporate headquarters to begin with.
I think that's
Are we permitted to ask questions?
Yeah.
I haven't read the code, Rick. Do you have architectural guidelines related to details and materials?
I don't think there's any architectural guidelines in there at all.
Because I would say that, to answer to comment on that, if your guidelines are like an urban design overlay, which it sounds like they are, that if you don't censor the architects with specific guidelines in architecture, that the result will be architecturally better, not whether they have a single building or not. If they have a place where the form-based code shows a plaza with an important building on it, then that would be a place. And if it's a place where it's a street and you're wanting to keep the street tight, activity along it, then you still might have a single building, but it would have a problem. So, but from an architect's point of view, and I can't help but wonder why there's no architect in this group, so TK is not a practicing architect up on this desk here, but in any event,
Be considered you.
and you I do think that the urban design and form-based codes are something that architects like when they don't censor us, because when we get hired by a developer and they want to do the dumbest thing, we can say, oh, we can't do that. No, I'm serious. We can say, look, this code is requiring us to do these things, so we just have to put up with it. And it actually helps us. And then you get the right heights and it's the right location. And so it's actually, as long as you don't tell us what to do architecturally, it's better for us. And it actually, you will need us to have the right, because you're giving some sameness, right, because of the street and the heights and things. So then you let us do our thing within that context, and it should be very nice. Very nice.
Because the standards, well, I mean, except for obvious like bulk mass and that stuff, deal with frontages and stoops. Well, I mean, depending on the context.
Basically, what the standards, and Joni's here to really correct me, this is my test, and I get chewed out afterwards when I remember all the details. Basically, what it deals with is frontage requirements, percentage at the build-to line. It deals with transparency. It deals with minimum height, maximum height, minimum first floor height. Gosh, what else? Let's see. It's pretty, yeah. Access, whether you can access your parking garage or not.
I think what Christine is talking about, there are 4 frontage types. Yeah. There's the storefront frontage, stoop frontage, porch frontage, and then Civic. Civic being the one that has a lot of flexibility. But they're not architectural standards. We've stripped a lot of that out through this process because we want that flexibility of design and allowing the architectural flavor to come through. But really how that first floor interacts is an urban design conversation. You can have it in a lot of different varieties in terms of style, but how the person feels as they pass by. You know, we've talked about what streets in Nashville do that well. I think Church Street does that well. 2nd Avenue historically does that well. Dedrick's abysmal, and we're going back and retrofitting that because it was so bad. So let's get it right the first time and not have to retrofit buildings.
Explain a little bit about the process in terms of, you know, you get an advisory committee and all this stuff, and just some of the issues that committee raises.
Sure. Well, we really started this when we updated the plan, and that started in 2006 and was adopted by the Planning Commission in 2007. So I think we had several meetings, like over 20 meetings, lots of participants, a lot of you in the room were in those meetings, to cast the vision. And then you start to talk about how does the zoning need to then align with the vision, because our zoning today does not align with the vision. So staff spent a couple of months, 6 months maybe, modeling the zoning and the policy in SketchUp to see where the points of conflict were and where the places, you know, if you're using a typical floor plate and you're trying to build within the sky exposure plane, will you ever get to your density rights? Not usually. So finding those things that we needed to talk about. And then we had these resource teams that you all have talked about, which are, and a lot of you participate in that too, folks who actively work downtown, developers, property owners, designers who know what the issues are with building regular buildings, and also how to navigate both the existing zoning and the proposed zoning. And we worked with those teams for a year. We had a central group, south, west, and north, and really talked with them about the details. If we say a 30-foot step back, is that a bad idea? Should it be 20? You know, those kind of conversations about how you typically build a regular building. Is this build-to zone unrealistic? Could you actually build out a building along that much of the frontage? So really having those conversations. And if I showed you the first draft, compared to where we are today. I mean, it's just radically different, and rightfully so, because we've had all these professionals giving their input on what is buildable and what can be applied with a broad brush and not with a, what everybody can meet in terms of minimum requirements.
I think there's two parts that are important to form-based codes that have been very important to this. One is having a vision of what you want. I mean, what did the community want the downtown to be? And that whole process of developing and updating the downtown plan was critically important. And the other part is that this is a downtown code that recognizes there's differences in different parts of downtown. I think we've got 18 neighborhoods that came out of that plan process, and the core of downtown is very different than the Lafayette neighborhood, which is different than the Gulf, which is different than the Sulphurdale neighborhood. And so it isn't coming in and saying, we're going to treat everything the same. We pulled out a lot of the things, for example, out of the Plan National in terms of maintaining the visibility to the Capitol. And so the height requirements are different in Sulphurdale than they are in some other areas to maintain that. But it allows you, what the form-based code does, I believe, generically, is allow you to actually focus on creating that vision, creating that plan, and then simply coding to it. We kind of joke a lot about that probably the first 8 or 10 codes that were developed through our planning process were form-based codes, but no one ever knew it because it wasn't important to know what kind of code it was. It was more important to develop a plan and say, okay, we want to get to it. And I think that part of what a form-based code does is allow you much more interaction with the community and achieving an objective. And I'll use Bedford Avenue maybe as an obvious example. We had probably 30 years of conflict in Bedford Avenue about how do you transition that one block between the intensity of Green Hills and the kind of the preservation of the single-family housing that was there. And there had been zoning attempt after zoning attempt using conventional zoning, and no one was willing, because they didn't know what was going to happen. There was no certainty about how the buildings would develop in terms of that, and so it never worked. But once we got everybody together and they said, we don't have any problem with 3-story buildings here and transitioning to 2-story buildings, the use is not as important, maybe more active uses on the Green Hill side and less active on the residential side. And as long as we can kind of create that space and putting that together in a relatively simple and straightforward format allowed both the private sector then to go in and buy the land, assemble the land, and some assurance if you're an individual out there building that what's going to happen next to you. So you could invest knowing what's going to happen next to you, and I think most people have been very, very pleased with what's happening out there.
I think the key to success in form-based codes is getting the calibration just right between how prescriptive it is and how flexible it is. In the 19th century in Germany, there were two professions building. One was the architect who did freestanding object buildings that were iconic. And the other were the Baumeisters, who did the bread and butter that made up the streets and squares of the city, often housing and commercial buildings. And the streets had built 2 lines and they were adhered to. And they got their gratification from, number 1, the craft of what they were doing, number 2, the internal workings of whatever building type they were working with, but also on the facade treatment. It's very important that the architect, I think, have flexibility in terms of facade treatment, as even with the most repetitive and non-iconic program types. And I think getting that dialectic right with a well-crafted document is the key. If it's confusing, if it's insufficiently detailed, or if it's overly detailed, then you get into some problems.
One thing I like to mention too as a developer in the form-based code, one of the things that cities really want to do, they really want to get the best people they can to come in and redevelop their cities. And some cities have the idea, well, you come in here and we sit down and we negotiate, and you're going to give so much for the road fund and so much for this and so much for that. And they just see it as an eagle flying by and they want something feathered out on the eagle. And in the real world today, developers who can do a good sized job are getting fewer and fewer, and the risk is getting less rewarded. And so for a city to want to be able to redevelop itself and to bring that revenue back into the city and make it a viable city, they've got to realize that they've got to take the initiative to go out there and basically help carve that path and create that vision. So it's easier to come in and to redevelop a section of town. I can tell you that we are invited to go to numerous cities just to try to replicate what we did in Lance Village. We have a city right now that's willing to buy the land, to assemble land, and actually, subordinate it to us if we will come and do something like that. And so it just gives you an idea of what's happening in the city right now. You think of the tax base that we created out of Lance Village alone for the city of Nashville. It's amazing to me, a councilman will say, well, we're letting the Walmart down the road come in, and we're not doing any road improvements down there, but they want me to do a big road improvement up here for a few houses. I said, well, Walmart's not going to be there without the houses. At the same time, density. I think density has to be a virtue. I'm a main proponent about if we're going to address the affordability of houses, we've got to build up and we've got to have density. The day of drive till you qualify is over. Spring Hill is a drive till you qualify city. In another 2 years, gas is going to be back at $4 or $5. We have people moving back into Nashville right now, out of those cities. That city is oversupplied houses. It's a city that has problems. And I think if the government ever stands back and looks at the phenomenon going on some of the foreclosures, it's not just the fact that people are having a problem losing their job. It's the fact that they're moving out of those cities and moving back to core cities. And so again, city planners have to take that into account. What are the price points that they need to hit to be able to get that workforce back into it that will take advantage of transit-oriented development and take advantage of mass transits that are inside the city?
Yeah, I want to say, just pick up two things on that, because I think it was interesting. I personally have been involved in form-based coding probably now for, 25 years, in one form or another. And one of the early opportunities I had was working with Andreas Guani on developing what was a parallel code or an optional form-based code. And it was interesting as we sat down and went through that, because this was a code, you would have conventional zoning where you'd have the option of doing a form-based code. And one thing that was really interesting that I've never forgotten is when you do an optional code, you really have to work hard at deciding what are the core elements that are critically important and where are the bells and whistles. Because it's really easy when you're doing that kind of code to put all the bells and whistles in, because you can make an argument that, well, if it's too much, then they're not going to do it. But if it's too much and they're not going to do it, you really lose the opportunity to provide the incentive for people to do a form-based code. So you really are able to having to strip down to where are the key elements, building placement and some of those types of things, and where you can go over it. And we as planners have framed the discussion on planning and certainly on zoning so much with regard to density and land use that it's the only tools that the public know to respond to. And one thing we have done, and I think it's been relatively successful, is to change our whole planning approach. Now this is about form-based codes, but you can't get to form-based codes without the plan. And what we've tried to do is to change the way we go about doing community plans or our comprehensive plan, if you will. And we've changed it to a community character approach. And with regard to that, what we're looking at is what type of community are you trying to create? Not whether it's residential, medium density, but what kind of community. And people, what we've found, we just finished up Madison, or just in the process of finishing up West Nashville now, we found that people are it's much easier for them to identify with, we want a community like this. We're looking for a community like, Hillsborough or Belmont, or we're looking for one like, Old Madison or Old Tommy. Or, you can talk about places that they have a sense of, that if you were using numbers and saying this is commercial or this is residential at medium density, they would never get that, and then they would tend to react in a way that says, I want the lowest number I can get, because that's got to be important. 10 or 12 units per acre in Hillsborough Belmont area is very different than if you think about a suburban 15 units per acre apartment complex. And people flock to one, and don't flock to the others. So if you get them talking more about community character that they're trying to create, it's been much more successful in laying the bridge or the stones towards getting to the type of community you want. And form-based coding is simply a tool that you use to get to the vision that you kind of
So
want.
how do you think, I mean, do you think that there's a possibility in the future with neighborhoods that want to preserve their character but have been sort of leery of preservation overlays to use the form-based code, so you don't have fights about can you have a dormer or not?
Well, I think so. I think we're already seeing it. We saw that in Nashville. Because we've talked about the type, the character that you want, suburban character, urban character, and those kinds of things. And then we've also talked about whether your intent is to maintain that character, and as opposed to kind of evolving that character into something slightly different and more intense. But any of those would allow a mixture of housing units. They would allow the possibility of introducing some commercial uses and some of those kinds of things in a way that you never would have been able to have. We've never had that discussion because you have to put a different color on the land use map. You have to put the red color on the land use map, and as soon as you put the red color on the land use map, then everybody's image goes to, you can pick out anything you want to, the tire store or the 7-Eleven or whatever, but that's very different. It's very different maybe than a bookstore that you have in London Village.
Okay, to specifically, maybe in a historic context, it's almost one of the most appropriate locations to apply form-based code because you would like in certain instances to be able to back away from the style issue that gets everybody so caught up that if I'm building next to a historic house, I have to replicate that historic house in order to be appropriate. And if you deal with it merely in terms of the form of the building that's going to fit that context, certain basic proportions and scale and so forth, you might be able to achieve a good historic contextual sort of code without having to impose all the gingerbread historic detail. TK, a couple months ago you said that so much about getting to a successful form-based code is finding the appropriate balance. And I think the balance is extremely important. The downtown code this does not apply to because like Rick said, like Joni said, it really doesn't get into the architecture. But I think when you've gone too far, you sort of overstep the appropriate balance is when you do begin to prescribe a little bit too much of the architecture, when you steal from the architect, from the designer, their craft, then it's probably gone too far. If a form-based code is merely a paint-by-numbers prescription, it's not allowing the architect to be the architect. It's not allowing the urban designer to be an urban designer if they're simply filling in with appropriate color of paint and creating all the detail that the planner has imposed upon the architect. I don't think that's an appropriate approach to form-based codes. And I don't know that that's really the case anywhere in Nashville.
No. Yeah, there is. Sure it is. I mean, in my neighborhood in East Nashville, there's been, I think, and this is getting real specific and bear with me, but on the corner of 12th and Woodland, you've got the post office on Woodland, and next to it you've got an infill that keys off of the 50s architecture of the post office. Same setback, same kind of brick, but with a contemporary kind of cutting edge. That was done before the preservation overlay was applied to that property. Right across the street, you've got an affordable housing unit that, because it's affordable housing, it was pretty stripped down to begin with, but it's got, the clapboards, well, I think they allowed running plank on that, but it's got roof pitch and little porch and all that other kind of stuff, but it's not nearly as interesting a building. But I'm highly skeptical that had the preservation overlay applied to the Polifilo house, which is the contemporary cutting edge one, that would exist, just because of the fact that when you find the preservation overlays in my neighborhood, and I've written negatively about this to some extent, you get replica-like stuff very frequently. And so I think that form-based code would allow, I think there's more potential in form-based code in historic areas in ways that maybe preservation overlays in future may not work so well, particularly in more commercial areas where, there's more flexibility to begin with because there's just not the same amount of uniform architecture to begin with.
I like to comment on the West End Park. We built 2 buildings on West End Circle, and if you look at the design standards that were in place, At the time, one of the lots we purchased allowed a 3-story building and one allowed a 4-story building. We decided to use 2 separate architects on those. One was Crossroads, one was Klein Sweeney. And we used entirely different architectural materials on both of those. And then Coda did a building right next to us that was entirely different. I think Klein Sweeney, no, finding design that particular one. But if you go in there and look at that, that's a good example of how that form-based code can work for you. It laid the guidelines out for us. The only thing that happened down there to us was that the market overheated. The value of the land got so high that the numbers didn't work, so we pulled our horns in. And we'll probably go back down there and do some additional buildings as the market, gets back stabilized in there again. But at the same time, you can ride through West End Park and see that the architects were not, tied to hands, were not tied. I think you would find a very variation of architectural features in it. At the same time, I'll tell you that as a developer, you've got to have somebody who's got the hat on straight. They cannot be going out there and designing something that will not hit the demand for the market. The failures sometimes in form-based code has nothing to do with the plan. It has to do with the guy that thought he was building a Taj Mahal out there and selling $1 million condos that this market don't exist.
Demographics are critical, and that's a component of price points. The whole American family situation and how many bedrooms people are buying now and how much flexibility they need over the course of their lifetime to grow or contract or to rent a component of their house is very, very different now than it was 15 years ago. And to be a successful developer, you've got to really, and I'm reinforcing what you're saying, you've got to really have your finger on that.
We give a talk, we call it the New American Family, and we give 5 different profiles that will actually buy one of our houses. And we go down and we study every single thing we can about that individual. We will design a product for a young lady coming out of college. She can buy between $100,000 and $120,000. We do not install a microwave in that house because we know she's coming out of college and mom and dad got a real nice microwave for her. But you know what we install? A washer and dryer because she doesn't want anything going in a public washer and dryer when she moves in that new condo. And so that's the kind of detail we do for our what we call TCGs, target consumer groups. And it's the same thing we do when we go to a empty nester buyer. We know an empty nester buyer now wants a walk-in shop with very little steps in the house. So it's all about really trying to hit the New American family that is out there buying homes and that want a specific product to fit their critical lifestyle change.
I think one thing that's really an advantage, typically the form-based codes, they provide more flexibility to actually adjust your construction to the market at that time. It's not nearly as restrictive, and it actually, because what generally you're selling is, as Dave said, was the community. And so the community is made up of a variety of housing types, a variety of large and small buildings and stuff like that. And so you can adjust. The ones that have been successful have been able to adjust relatively a lot quicker than the conventional development. The problem we have, and it's evidenced, I think, in West End Park and others, is that in creating a great sense of place, there's a market for that. And the market simply drives, when we have a normal market, if we ever had that, I'm not sure whether we've ever had a normal market, but the scarcity of quality places drive the prices up. And so the objective would be to, let's provide more and more of these places where, they begin to have a normalizing effect on the market where you're not simply paying for the quality of the community, because I think you can respond much more effectively over time in terms of changing your housing types and the differences in the market happen. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of issues, and David mentioned one of them, and it comes back to financing and the difficulty of financing. Even, if you think about historically, financing has been very easy if you can finance by the numbers. I do small single-family houses. I go to the small single-family housing finance person, and they plug in the numbers, and I get my money. I want to do a neighborhood development that has single-family and large single-family and small single-family and townhouses and flats. Well, there is the financing person out there that understands how you put all that stuff together, and so that's on top of everything else.
Manuel, do you have a question?
In the downtown code, how are you handling? How does land use density and parking regulation come
Right now, land uses are almost, we've got 4 sections of downtown, and the land uses are 90%, 95% of the same in those 4 sections. There's a few differences, but not very much. Density is regulated by height. We have a fairly, the most intense is the core area, which really, I guess has unlimited height there. There are 30 stories, and that's 30 stories. And there are bonuses, fairly significant bonus provisions for certain things. We're still working through the LEED bonus provision, workforce housing bonus, open space. We don't identify required locations for plazas. I think Larry mentioned that and stuff like that, but we do identify areas of the downtown there that are deficient in terms of open space, and there's 4 or 5 of those in terms of the neighborhoods. And you have an opportunity to purchase land there and transfer from bonus into, say, the downtown or any of the others and get additional height. What else we got height? What are bonuses? Let's see. Oh, there's civic uses and stuff that has a bonus there. And in each of those, you can add height up to a certain amount other than in the core itself. I mean, you might otherwise be able to get 7 stories of height, but on Lafayette, for example, you don't want 7 more stories of height. You can add 3 stories or something like that.
So FAR is no longer...
FAR is not a controlling factor. Parking is not a controlling factor. You know, I've been in this a long time, and I've decided that it's almost impossible for anybody to build a building without the parking that they think they need. Either they think they need or the financing person thinks they need, so I don't necessarily need to tell them how much parking they need. So we don't have, as of 10 o'clock meeting with Public Works, we didn't have any parking requirements in the downtown code, right? Is that still okay?
As of 11 o'clock, we still do not have parking.
Okay.
The comment on the parking, we have no parking requirements in our MUL area of Lance Village. But at the same time, we're smart enough to only put one restaurant in one section of it and not bring another restaurant in. But we got a dentist office that uses it in the daytime, the restaurant uses it at nighttime. So the shared parking works very, very well. And at the same time, in the same parking lot, there are some that's marked reserved. And we allow 1 unit that's reserved per condominium that we build out there. And some of them are 1 bedroom, most of them are 2 bedrooms. But at the same time, when we built a new building, a lifestyle building, which we like to invite anybody to come out and walk and tour, we made sure that we built a $5 million parking garage and then surrounded the condos around it. And that was a major expenditure, but at the same time, we knew we had to do that to address the parking. At the same time, we still know parking is tight. At the same time, we know we're right at the right balance for what we're going to put in the center.
One extreme example is in the city of Seattle downtown. Their transit is so evolved that you cannot legally build a new parking structure unless it's convertible to future residential or office space. And they see that as a demographic trend over the next decade or 2. By the way, I was just in Portland where I was astonished. I spent about a 3-mile walk through the downtown and did not see a single surface parking lot. And every other street, it seems, has, double light rail going on. It was incredible. You could jaywalk to your heart's content. There were so few cars on the streets of downtown Portland, and yet it's 12-story downtown, really.
One thing I don't know if this project will happen or not, but we're actually looking at the idea of in workforce housing is to be able to buy the project or rent that project, you have to make a commitment to use public transportation. It's on a bus stop. But the idea is then you can eliminate the amount of parking spaces to make the project affordable, and the 2 start working together.
Well, I mean, obviously, you've got to kind of balance out. We don't have the transit system that Portland and a lot of places have to be able to do that. And obviously, Portland doesn't have, I think in 82 or 83, they outlawed the ability to have surface parking. And so, they've got regulations on that. But what we're looking at is a situation where, I'll be pretty blunt, if we've got a developer that's dumb enough to put a building up without the parking that they think they need, then I can't help them by telling them everybody how much parking they need to have. Now, there are differences of opinion. There are departments that get complaints that there aren't enough parking. Even though we all agree there's no parking downtown. Now, I've never been downtown ever where I couldn't find a parking space. there may not be a parking space at the front door of where I want to go, but there is a parking space in a relatively short walk of anywhere in downtown that you ever want to go at any point in time. And so I think that, I think the market itself is a perfectly appropriate place to determine the parking requirements in an area like that.
What's the relationship to the SP? I mean, not that there's a direct corollary, but do you see that a form-based code will mean we'll have less requests for SP, or, I mean...
Well, under an ideal situation, what we would do would be to develop for Davidson County, develop appropriate form-based codes for the entire county, and then you would see less of a need. In order to do that, however, you've got to have the capacity to actually do the plans. The coding is not nearly as difficult as doing the plans and deciding what the vision is, working with the community to define the vision. Once you've done that, then you can calibrate the code itself and go forward. So, under an ideal situation, what we try to do is to put the plans in place, whether it's Harding Town Center or Weston Park or whatever it is, to where people can then go and take advantage of those, and you don't need to go through a planning process or a rezoning process. Our goal downtown, after we've gone through this plan, is to make it, again, easy for people to get out there and do their thing. Let's define what that is, what we want as a community, and then turn people loose to do it.
I think also, it goes back to the economic viability of that city, and that for a city to really function as a community again. And so how does it come back to, I go back and constantly say that, it's really ability to create a long-range plan that as market conditions improve or market conditions go down, people can be patient and bring it on. I can tell you that I've had a signing knock on my door every 6 months in my community. I told a guy, I don't want a signing. And he looked at me one day and he said, what's wrong with a sign? And I said, it would mess up my neighborhood. And he kept going back and forth. And finally one day I said, I'm going to tell you in a southern way. I said, it's kind of like putting a turd in a witness sample box. You just don't fit there in the whole box. and the signs belong in a certain place, but it isn't belong in my neighborhood. Go with your role. That's right. Question.
I have a question. I'm assuming Nashville's doing the Delani format, the 6 tiers, and advancing the size of them every certain year. What does the city put in place for when you go from T4 to T5 density for municipalities like stormwater, civic garages? Is Nashville looking at that and how they need to increase the
We're not using the smart code as a format for our form-based code. We do use the transect in doing the community planning aspect, but the upgrades will happen as you upgrade that plan itself and go transition. It's not necessarily built automatically in like the smart code is.
Well, I guess so Nashville is looking at as these neighborhoods develop of what they're going to require in municipal services like upsizing the student stormwater.
We look at that at the time we're doing the plan.
Okay.
We're not doing that as we're not developing it. West End Park, for example, is probably a T4, maybe T4, and it's a fairly intense T4, but we don't see it evolving necessarily into a T5.
Okay.
We were required to put attention.
Yeah, we have that, but yeah. I think the question was, well, how do you anticipate it intensifying over time? We're planning for what it ought to be and then putting that infrastructure in.
The central core is defined south all the way to Gateway, Green Meadows, talk about that in terms of, because traditionally, everybody's always thought the central core is stuck at Broadway and then in Sobro, but talk about...
You're right in the sense that Sobro is the next core, if that makes sense, or core expansion, but there are standards that are slightly different for Sobro than for the core, particularly step backs within the building. So, we have this sort of sheer tower form along Church Street and along Commerce, but in Sobro,
the ability to do sheer.
You have the ability, you don't have to do sheer if you don't want to. But in Sobro, it's more of the, almost the pinnacle model or the encore model where you may have shares on some sides, but not all. But they are capped at the same height of 30 stories with bonuses above. So it is, you know, the plan expanded the boundaries of these development rights, more intense development rights, and the code has been going back
And explain that in terms of why.
Mhm.
Explain why. Is that just sort of recognizing that some people who look at it and wanted to max out on the land value? Or?
I think it's, I can't speak to the economics of it, I can tell you the form of it, okay? So we looked at the core policy and the core CC zoning, and there are very few properties left there that are vacant. There's one or two surface parking lots you can think of, but in order to encourage the preservation of the buildings that we have today, whether they're historic or not, you have to expand the development opportunities elsewhere. So Sobro's got a lot of surface parking lots, even that area sort of west of the core, towards the railroad gulch, a lot of surface parking lots. So we'd rather intensify the zoning in those places to see new buildings rather than taking a perfectly viable building that may be too small and tearing it down to build something that's bigger. So that's why the boundaries are sort of expanded that way. And also you can say the same thing in the Gulch. I mean, we have great projects coming in the Gulch that were not allowed by right and today would be allowed by right, hoping that we'll see more of that intensity by right in the future.
Talk to us about topography. I'm thinking particularly in Sobro because there's so much different topography because you've got like floodplain up to 1/5 or something like that. You've got the hill to the south, you've got gradually sloping up to the west, and consideration of viewshed preservation and those kind of issues. How much, it's not obvious on the map how you've handled that. So,
well, Christine, one of the things that we've had to balance in codifying this or creating the code and our calibration level is how far do we get into those elements of urban design, if that makes sense. So we have the plan of Nashville, I kind of see as this broad vision for what we want the inner city to be like. Then the downtown plan narrows that a little bit to the inner loop and has fleshes it out a little more. But the code has to, it's custom tailored for each neighborhood, but it also has to be very broad in its minimal or maximum standards and minimal standards, however you want to look at it. So it's hard to integrate maybe those elements of urban design without being too heavy-handed, if that makes sense. So the places like north of the Capitol, that's a clear thing that you can calibrate. You can codify building height. I don't know that there's a way to codify view sheds or codify terminus endings or something like that. Those things that we think of in terms of traditional urban design. That's hard to integrate into a code without being overly restrictive on the designers, if that makes sense. Can I answer your question? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would, I mean, essentially I'm interpreting what you said, that to get into those kind of nuances of viewshed stuff in connection with Rutledge Hill and then the rising land to the west and stuff like that could end up being...
They can be conflicting. I mean, we need a place for taller buildings, and we have to choose where that happens. If I'm being brutally honest, I don't know if you're in a 2 or 3 story building, if you have a right to a view shed. You know, that's a very small building. It should be part of an urban fabric. Your view should be the street, not a skyline view if you're in a building that small. So I think there may be a change in perception in terms of what urbanity is.
I think this is tangential at best, but and maybe more philosophical and certainly not Nashville specific.
David's getting philosophical.
No, I would be curious, especially to hear an architect's response to this, or Rick as well. But it seems like the whole notion that we need form-based codes is a response to a lack of understanding within the design community, within the development community about what good urban design is. We understand architecture, but not architecture is distinct from urban design. And if you had people like the Baumeisters in Germany, or elsewhere that really understood what was appropriate to context, who could take in a context and all of its many, many facets, all of those things that go into creating good design. And if they could then respond to that context and create a good design, you wouldn't need the prescription.
Well, is it designers or developers or both?
Both. I think it's both.
Larry, jump in here.
Yeah.
No, the reason the script was the planners would let us do it. For years and years, they said the parking lot had the only way you could build the building and have the setback was to put the parking between the street and the building. And all this is, all what we're saying is really just trying to get back to where you don't put the parking between the street and the building. And you put, people can walk along the street and have a storefront with the window in it to see the cookies inside or the dresses. That's all this is all about, I think, mainly. And that's the heart of it. And we got away from that because in the early 20th century, a lot of French architects, or one particular one, got everybody thinking of objects in a park, which became objects in a parking lot. And that's where all many of the planners bought into that totally. And all the codes that were written were based on that concept. And so you had apartments, parking, whatever the building is, it wouldn't be mixed use, because that also was, that was part of this whole thing.
Well, I think that's
that one architect can take all the blame, we know that. But all of us, as all the design groups now realize that that was a problem. And a lot of it had to do with just the introduction to automobile and all that, but everybody's on the same page now, so I don't think it's,
Well, you completely agree with that. What you're saying is precisely what I was trying to get at, that there's been sort of this paradigm shift in the 20th century. But the idea that we now, instead of an architect being trained to take a site and a white sheet of paper on which to design the building in the space, there needs to be a retraining, I'm not picking on architects, but in the design community generally, planners, architects, the community at large, the developers, to understand the building as an element within a composition, not as a standalone object.
That's happening. I think that's probably all happened, but I think that the code, you still look at the code.
No, I think you're right. I think that what has happened, for whatever reasons, codes got written, and so architects and landscape architects began, and landscape architects and architecture schools began to respond to training in response to codes, and we've trained generations of the public to expect those kinds of codes and that kind of development, whether it's good or bad. I have a very safe investment if I buy a single-family house in a subdivision that's priced, from $200,000 to $225,000, and it's not nearly as good as if I have, some 175s and some 250. That throws everything out of kilter. And we train people that way, and so I think that, as planners, our job is to change the codes to enable people to do what they do, and ultimately, the whole system has to kind of get changed, but it's not, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. We're trying to do it, I'm very impatient, we're trying to do it a lot faster than probably we can, but we've got to kind of move that way. I joke about, that if in fact we put together a plan and we have the zoning in place, then the private market can work. If in fact we expect someone to come in and rezone the property, no matter how good the project is, what we've done as a planner is when we go out there and put that sign that says rezoning hearing, come down to City Hall, what we're telling that neighbor is that the person is asking for something that they're not otherwise allowed to do. It doesn't make any difference how good the project is. Putting the sign there only tells them your job as a neighbor is to come down and protest that, because if they were doing what they ought to be doing, there wouldn't be a sign in front of the house. There wouldn't be a hearing, and I wouldn't be, no matter how good it is. So we've got to kind of reorient that thinking, as long as, it's just remarkable when you talk to people and they say, well, what's going on next door? And we tell them it's going to be a big, huge building, and they say, we say, well, that's what it's zoned for. And they say, oh, okay, if it's zoned for that, that's okay.
Yeah, the zoning hearing, the only people that ever show up is the people who are opposed to it.
So that's their job, is to be opposed to it. They don't care what it is. Their job is to come out here and oppose it, because there's a sign in front of the building, in front of the lot.
Yeah, I go back to the customer too, and I think that one of the things that, people forget, and when you start looking at an urban environment, is what do the customers want to live in that city? What are they looking for? And one of the things we found, one of the little studies we did recently was that the number one goal for the student, the majority of the students coming out of major universities right now is to move to a city where they do not have to own an automobile, so they do have mass transit. So they don't have to throw those dollars away, because owning a car is very, very expensive. And so when you start looking at a city like Nashville right now with this form-based code, how does it play back into someone who's trying to come here, or a corporation? I can tell you right now, there's one of the sister cities in Nashville, Franklin here, they are struggling with affordable housing. We've met with their people down there, and we talked about what we thought they need to do to address affordable housing. And their idea is to say, well, we'll let you build a mansion over here, but build me 5 affordable houses over there. And it doesn't work, you know. And so they've got to start looking at, you know, they're going to have to bring density into the equation. And they've got to look at, you know, if they're going to continue to have corporations move into those cities, they've really been able to play real heavily off of Nashville. I can tell you, because I sell a lot of product all throughout the Nashville area. Because the workforce, the secretaries and the young executives and stuff like that, they live in Davidson County. When they get to a certain amount of age with kids and stuff, they do move down to Franklin and stuff. But you have a lot of those people that move to those corporations here. And they realize that down in Franklin that they've got to address workforce housing. And how are they going to do it? And I think Nashville, we're lucky to have Rick, because he sees a way to be able to do the form-based codes that allow us to come back in and do it. It doesn't have to be large scale always. It can be a scale equal to West End Park. And if you go to West End Park, what you'll find is probably about 70% of them either work at HCA or Vanderbilt University. That's your number one buyer. And they'll continue to buy in that area as the project is developed.
I have one final question, and it's public works and the intersection of public works and this, and is there sort of a discipline of public works or a way to, I mean, it's fine to talk about good urban design and pedestrian experience and everything, but as long as, for example, in suburbs, you've got the one-man payers of second and fourth, and people who are going to and from the interstate, that really seriously erodes anything you're going to be able to do with sidewalk design. So, I mean, is there any way to, or are they totally on board with this whole thing and they're about to redo their major downtown street plan?
I mean, public works, fire standards, all those are issues that have to be dealt with, because they all, you know, they all have a critical impact on, you know, on the built environment. You know, fire departments love to argue they've got to get that fire truck there as quickly as possible. But if in fact what you're doing is over-designing the streets, they're also going and picking up the person who gets run over in the crosswalk. So there's a balance in terms of, you know, and to be honest, 95% of fire calls, fire department calls, or EMS calls that they're running with ambulances, not to get fire equipment. So you've got to, but our mentality, whether it's a financial mentality or whatever, is specialization. And how do we optimize our own individual part of the pie? We've got to figure out a way to look at how do we build quality communities that are more sustainable.
And I think the city mayors and stuff have to be realizing who they're recruiting to go in those spots. We have architect design big building for us. It has 5-foot corridors going through it. And we have a fire marshal saying he doesn't want to get like safety approved, because one door opens into the hallway. It's only 36 story. You still have plenty of room. Architects arguing, here's a fire guy getting on that. Same thing with public works is that they have to see those people. We actually went to an exercise at Lennox to try to convince the fire chiefs that we did not need those big, wide, 3-lane roads going through the neighborhood. 2 fire chiefs within our community today. And because they follow the community through it. So
they also found a way to penalize you, as I recall. You've got an interstate quality bridge. They may lose over here, but they're going to find some way to screw you on the other end.
Any last questions or comments out there? No? Well, in my experience, developers are looking for 2 things, level playing field and no surprises. And I think form-based codes is something that works in that direction. Let me just mention quickly, there are 3 meetings coming up. Wednesday, the 29th of April at 10 a.m. That's at the downtown library auditorium. And the other 2 meetings are there as well. 7th of May, that's a Thursday at 6. And the 13th of May on a Wednesday at 3 p.m. So if you're interested, show up.
We said, if you haven't seen the building at the corner of Lone Oak and Hillsborough Road, I don't know if you've seen that, you should drive by and see, because that's the best example to get rid of this code we've ever. It's like a pure, manifestation of the existing zoning.
Right.
It's orders.
It's the model. They're the wedding table.
No,